Okay, guys, welcome to week 2 of Art History 212. We're going to be looking at a couple of different movements here. We talked about early photography in class, and then we're going to be focusing on realism, the PreRaphaelites, as well as Impressionism in this lecture here. So with the beginning of photography, we also have realism coming into play, which you can see sort of with the invention of photography comes people trying to depict the reality of the world. So that's in the early 19th century and as a reaction against Romanticism, which we talked about last week. So there's a continued reaction to the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, like we talked about. We also have this occurring in the mid-19th century in France. Again, another French Revolution of 1848 this time, with the overthrow of King Louis Philippe in 1848. And then the peasants overthrew these rulers for Napoleon, and he dissolved the Republic into the Second French Revolution and became the last French monarch. And his empire ends in 1870. So a lot of sort of controversy going on in France with the removal of monarchs, again, for a republic. So a lot of sort of turmoil and the move to focusing on the subject matter of everyday life. So they wanted to paint what they saw. It was really considered inappropriate to paint these type of people before this, but it became very powerful during this time period to do so. It was relatively naturalistic mode, and it really depicted the gritty side of reality and the lowest members of society as well. So you have Gustave Courbet being a really famous realist painter at the time, and this is his Stonebreakers from 1849. And in this painting, we have sort of the lowest members of the French society with sort of a circle of life situation. So here you have this older generation. You can see his clothes are tattered, and he's working as a stonebreaker, maybe 70 or so, and then this very young individual here on the left, who's a younger man who is picking up this trade as well. So it's kind of supposed to be this juxtaposition of opposites, this poor that always remain poor by contrasting these two ages, right? The older and the younger. It's not supposed to be romanticized or idealized in any way. It's kind of this thankless toil. I mean, can you imagine sort of working in stones and breaking stones? It has to be kind of a thankless job that nobody wants to do for their entire lives. And that life kind of begins and ends the same way. It's kind of dark, right? And not only that, but Courbet kind of shields their faces so that it could be anyone, right? It could be your father, it could be your grandfather. You're supposed to see yourself, your life in these people and individuals. He uses sort of these dirty browns and grays to get this kind of dreary nature of it, as well as sort of the gritty side of reality of these figures. So people are having the same dissatisfaction in France with the uprising of the poor. This work, as Proudhon has called the first socialist picture ever made, a satire in our industrial civilization, which continually invents wonderful machines to perform all kinds of labor, yet is unable to liberate the man from the most backbreaking toil. So really, Courbet was interested in depicting sort of these moments of sort of sadness, but also reality of people in France at the time. Courbet is also famous for this painting, A Burial at Ornans from 1849. And instead of me telling you about it, I have included a video of from the Khan Academy talking about it. But Courbet wasn't even able to exhibit this painting because of the controversial nature, which you'll learn about shortly from some very poised-speaking people at a museum. If I ever talk like that, please. But Courbet seemed to have enjoyed the controversy when some of his works were refused by the jury for a special salon at the International Exposition of 1855. He rented a building near the fair's Pavilion of Art and installed a show of his own works, which he called the Pavilion of Realism. So stop the lecture here and go watch that video on the Khan Academy, which is a link on the Moodle. Millais is also a very famous realist as well. This is The Gleaners from 1857. And here we have a look at three women gathering grain at harvest time. And what you have is they are gleaning. And gleaning, or the gathering of grains left over after the harvest, was a form of relief offered to the rural poor. So it's this really back-breaking work where you have the people in the background here who've already come and collected the wheat. So this is the wheat being harvested and put away. These are sort of the everyday workers. And here you have the gleaners, which are these women, and they're coming in and picking up these remnants of the wheat to feed themselves and their families. So this really intensely backbreaking work that was provided to the poor, right, to feed them, which you can imagine probably isn't really that effective. And so he represents sort of this heartbreaking work of these individuals at the time, and as they are picking up these pieces of wheat. This work may seem semi-familiar because Banksy did this in Agency Job from 2009, in which you have the sort of figure that escapes to smoke a cigarette. So sort of a critique on society as well in Banksy's work. Here we have finally a female painter, Rosabona here, and this is Plowing in the Nivernais, which becomes a very famous image. She was a very popular painter of farm life. She was raised in Paris, but sort of had an aversion to it and wanted to paint farms and animals, etc. And so we'll have this image. She's also going to be important in Impressionism as well with the Horse Fair, which is not a work we're going to talk about. But this is a very famous work of hers, which she has these sort of diagonal composition of cows moving forward and farming. This really interesting sort of powerful beasts, anonymous workers, and fertile soil offer a reassuring image of the continuity of agrarian life. What's also really interesting about Rosabona here is she often dressed in men's clothing to sort of gain access to animals and to study them. So when she went to study for the Horse Fair and other works, she would gain permission from the police to dress as a man, and then she would go and sketch there. And she didn't want to sort of receive too much attention, so she dressed as a man, which has sort of become an interesting factor in her work and sort of thinking about who she is as a person and a painter. The next realist that we're going to talk about is Honoré Daumier, and he's really known as being a caricaturist as well as a lithograph and cartoon maker. So we're going to talk about some of his works because they're really interesting. And he's going to really comment on the foibles of the bourgeoisie, the corruption of law, and the competence of a blundering government. At this time, the French didn't have a lot of political power and freedom of speech. And so Honoré Daumier is really going to be a big part of sort of trying to get freedom of speech for the French, which is not going to happen for him, unfortunately. Here is one of these first caricatures that he drew. He's going to produce a cartoon in which he talks about the King Louis Philippe, looking like a pear, and his head looking like a pear. And the French government is going to sort of say, oh, well, you shouldn't produce images like this, and he doesn't look like a pear, like, what are you talking about? And so he literally draws the king turning into a pear to show how much his head looks like a pear. This was one of several drawings that sort of made the monarchy kind of a laughingstock of the French country at the time, which they did not like. And that's really going to occur with Gargantua in 1831. And it depicted Louis Philippe as this obese monarch. He sits on a throne, and his loyal subjects feed him tax money. So here they are feeding him tax money, and he's going to chomp down on it. And what you're going to see upon sort of closer inspection is that he's literally on sort of a toilet chair in which he is pooping out legislation. And handing it here to his minions. So it sort of talked about how keeping these rich and powerful people in control to keep the country obedient. So Daumier is going to receive 6 months in jail because of this cartoon and the depiction of the monarchy, which is really going to be sort of this substantial moment in sort of French repression of free speech. And of course, what Daumier does the minute that he is out of prison is to produce another cartoon called So You Want to Meddle with the Press from 1833, in which he depicts a man operating the press, here crushing King Louis Philippe under a press. And the reason that we know that this is the French king, though it's sort of hard to tell for us, oops, is that the king was known for carrying around an umbrella, which apparently was supposed to show that he was a man of the people. And so that's how the French public would have known that was him. And so it became this very sort of negative image, and the monarchy was, again, very unhappy with Daumier. And his final work here that I'm going to show you is probably his sort of most controversial and interesting, as well as very grim. And so this is a late work produced, and it commemorated the assassination by the National Guard of innocent citizens during an uprising in Paris in April 1834. So what we're going to see is an army who was representing the silk workers' revolt in Lyon went, and the French government was trying to sort of harshly suppress the uprising of the French people. And the French troops were fired upon by people barricaded in this sort of building, this working class building in Rue Transnonain, which is a street. And these French troops who are going to get fired on, in response, are going to enter into this building that's on this street and sort of start to eradicate its occupants. And what it depicts is the literal shooting of innocents in this building that had nothing to do with this fight between the silk workers and the government, and these are just the people who died in their sleep. And so you can see sort of the central figure here. He's dressed in a nightgown. He was clearly sleeping. We have a shot to the head of a baby who he's crushing below, as well as dead figures around as well. The quote that came from the man who published this work was, "This lithograph is horrible to behold, as horrible as the dreadful event it recounts. It shows a murdered old man, a dead woman, the corpse of a terribly wounded man lying upon the body of a poor little baby whose head is split open. It is not a satire, it is a bloody page in history of our modern era, a page sketched by a powerful hand and inspired by a lofty imagination. In this drawing, Daumier has risen to noble heights. He has created a picture that, although painted in black and white on a sheet of paper, excuse me, will nevertheless prove of lasting value. The butchery of Rue Transnonain will remain an indelible stain on those who permitted it, and the drawing here discussed will stand as a medal struck to perpetuate the memory of a victory over 14 old men, women, and children." So it became this intensely specific sort of social commentary that Daumier was making on the French people and the French government and how they responded. And so what is going to end up happening is they're going to confiscate this work, destroy impressions of it, and Louis Philippe is going to really censor culture and their right to freedom of speech, which you can really imagine after these sort of works come out mocking him and treating him like he's an idiot. But Daumier really had this very strong effect on art and on realism. The next artist we're going to talk about is Edouard Manet. Not to be confused with Claude Monet, who's an impressionist, as Manet will be an impressionist as well. So try to keep them separate in your head. Manet starts out as a realist and moves into impressionism. So this is one of his works of art, known as Luncheon on the Grass, which was a pretty big scandal contemporary viewers at the time. He was considered a very radical artist, and it was considered very immoral. Here we have this sort of suburban picnic featuring not only sort of these very nude women who are sitting sexually and bathing, but they're alongside potentially their clients. Maybe they're prostitutes. Here they are fully dressed at this sort of sexual forest picnic. At this time, salons didn't really want to see nudity in the context of sort of contemporary life. It was supposed to be much more acceptable in sort of classical tales and images, and what Manet does reveal is that he very much was reflecting on classical images. So here we have something like Pastoral Concert by Titian, where you have two nude females with two clothed figures. You also have this scene called from the Judgment of Paris, right here, in which he's definitely reflecting on this image from this etching here in this painting as well. So even though he was very much depicting these images from classical life, from classical images, he takes it and makes it different. And this is really where the Salon starts to have trouble with his work. And we're going to see in the next work really where that sort of um, where he really sort of upsets the salon culture. But here we have this image here with this luncheon on the grass. And there's sort of different interpretations of this work. Could be betrayal of modern alienation as figures fail to connect with each other. Could have something to do with the sexuality of this nude figure who's looking at you. She's potentially a prostitute. And we're sort of staring at her and making eye contact. So we're not really sure to the intention of Luncheon on the Grass by Manet. But his most famous work is Olympia, which is really sort of the biggest and most controversial work, but the work that he's usually most known for. So Olympia is named, this work is named after a popular prostitute name of the time. Also featured elements like the orchid in her hair and bracelet and pearl earrings, which would identify her as wealthy but sensual, and identifying her thus as a prostitute. So here you have this prostitute figure who's being represented, and although, again, very much so, Manet is referring to classical imagery, like Titian's Venus of Urbino, she is a classical goddess. Being nude is very much part of the attraction of love and romance, and this metaphoric idea of who she is and what she represents, as the dog represents fidelity, and she's potentially a bride. Olympia represents something very, very different. So Olympia stares down at us. She's sort of coldly indifferent. You have this reaction of this cat, which is kind of standing on end, which is a little hard to tell because it's dark. Unlike the sleeping dog in Titian, you have this sort of feisty cat. The French would have known the word for vagina that is connected to the word cat. I'm not going to say it here, but you can probably guess what it is. So they very much knew that and used the cat to sort of represent that in sort of a funny way. She stares at us and has this sense of power and strength, and we're supposed to be the Johns that are purchasing her trade. And so she's sort of subverting the tradition of the accommodating female nude. She's not bringing you in with sort of any power of femininity or sensuality, but she has this strong gaze, this very dark outline body that's very cold and white in the center, and she's confronting you with her power and her strength as this very sort of powerful figure. And this would not have been a popular view. You don't really want to think about prostitutes maybe having personalities or power or strength over you. And so he's representing women in this very different way than we've seen previously in the representation of prostitutes and figures in French society. And we're going to see that how he approaches that as well in Impressionism. She was also modeled after a very real woman, which would have been very controversial at the time to represent this lovely woman as a prostitute. Also, same woman that's used in the Luncheon on the Grass. And so using a real woman and not a mythological character would have been very controversial. Not until recently have we had some of the larger conversations about The other figure in this scene, the black woman here featured as Olympia's maidservant. And although obviously this is 15 years after slavery has been abolished in France, these stereotypes still exist, right? Of having this maidservant, of having someone who's serving a white woman in this scene. And so it's hard to know what Manet was trying to get at with featuring this woman in the scene. Luckily, we have started to get some information, some great information from the Smithsonian and other museums that have kind of gone in and tried to research back through the lives of the black women that modeled for some of these famous painters. Because even though Manet sort of paints her and says, oh, she's beautiful, and he painted her a lot, and she's featured in his pocketbook. We believe her name is Laure or Laura. It was a woman that he painted often in some of his works, such as Olympia. They're starting to get some more information about who she was and trying to build up these ideas. So some of these paintings that have long had sort of very negative names are being renamed in the names of the women that they were painted after, which is great. So going back and trying to rethink some of this very negative history and the negative naming of some of these works and trying to combat those issues. So Manet was likely painting her as sort of a part of this scene that would have been typical in France at the time, but it does really fit into our stereotypes of black women as maidservants to white women at the time. So someone like Olympia, who is being serviced here. There was other article I read that said there was some sort of sexuality between them. Whether or not you sort of take that in, I'm not sure. That sounds sort of weird, but it's just the continuing sort of racial stereotypes that exist in the West at this time. Even obviously in people who are trying to break down those stereotypes about women and who women are, is still upholding others. But at least we get to know who she is, and sort of her part in Manet's work. So as this very strong female figure who's a prostitute stands, Manet tries to submit her to salon culture and salons, and he receives a very stern rejection. So here's some sort of the criticism that we receive and have recorded from the time. Never has a painting excited so much laughter, mockery, and catcalls as this Olympia. An artist cannot treat the public lightly without compromising his reputation, which sometimes never recovers, and Monsieur Manet is certainly pursuing something other than the sad celebrity obtained by such perilous procedures. We prefer to think he has made a mistake, and what is his aim? His canvases are too unfinished for us to possibly tell. If a canvas of Olympia was not destroyed, it is only because of the precautions that were taken by the administration. Oh, you wanted a nude? And you chose Olympia, the first that came along. And you can imagine then the caricatures that were produced at the time. Here is one where Olympia is covered completely by the flowers that she has potentially received from a suitor or a man purchasing her. And here she is sort of looking horrendous and ugly. Here's another where they believe that she looked quite like a man, very manly and very unsexual. So here is that represented in a cartoon as well. You even have Daumier joining in. His work doesn't seem to mock her as much as sort of lead to confusion. Why the devil is that fat, red-faced woman in her nightdress called Olympia? But my dear, perhaps that's the name of the black cat. Not that funny. We're going to briefly talk here about American art and how we see American art as well. So we've mostly been focusing on French art and how French art is sort of moved forward. So realism is going to move into Impressionism in France, but we're also going to see American art. And what's interesting about American art is they felt more of a need to sort of defend their art and artistic identity. They didn't want to resist the Academy as much. They felt this desire to follow tradition. So you have this really interesting difference in American art versus European art. So we're just going to look at it quick here with some of these works by famous American artists. First artist we're going to look at is Henry Osawa Tanner. He was considered the first African American painter to really gain international success outside of the US. He's going to be spending a lot of time in Paris. He really thought that Paris accepted him more as an artist and an individual, and so he's going to spend a lot of time there, but he is going to come back and paint some interesting and important portraits of African American subjects. There is still a lot of negativity in the South. The U.S. had abolished slavery only 24 years earlier, and Tanner's mother had not only been born a slave and escaped north to Pennsylvania through the Underground Railroad, but he was also named with the middle name Osawa, chosen from the Osawatomie, Kansas, where the site of the abolitionist John Brown's bloody confrontation with pro-slavery partisans. And so when he came back to the U.S. To work in Philadelphia, he started sort of painting these ideas and thinking about sort of the negative stereotypes and racism going on in the South at the time. And he does this kind of through these very simple and beautiful genre scenes. We have this one here, the banjo lesson, from 1893, in which you have this sort of elderly man teaching a boy, assumed to be his grandson, how to play the banjo. You have this sort of muted scene, which gives you the sense that there might be a sense of poverty here with the kind of stark objects around and the muted palette. You also have the light of the fireplace coming in from the left and kind of having this glow on these two figures who are centered here. And it's very much sort of emphasizes like the closeness and the beauty of the family, but also the modesty of the surroundings as well. A lot of information that focus on this work really talk about what Tanner was trying to depict in this work. And a lot of it goes back, he did study a lot of images of figures playing banjos to try to get the right scene for this particular work and to try to get the proportions and ideas right. But a lot of his work is in reference to some of the racist issues and ideas circling in the South at the time, especially among minstrel shows, and the idea of the way that Black men are being portrayed. Black men had long been stereotyped as entertainers in American culture, and images of the Black man playing the banjo appear throughout American art in the late 19th century. Scholars describe these figures as looking boisterous, jaunty, buffoonish, the very chains of slavery still sort of in these really negative, horrific stereotypes and images of Black men at the time. And so while Tanner is sort of seeing this in Philadelphia, experiencing this for himself, or Pennsylvania, I'm sorry, not Philadelphia. Oh no, Philadelphia. He did live in Philadelphia. He is rethinking some of the ideas, seeing the way that Black men are being portrayed, and instead does this sort of sensitive reinterpretation, thinking about these stereotypes and creating this image of generational torch passing, this very graceful, noble, intelligent, intimate act of these two people engaged with the grandfather teaching the grandson how to play the banjo. And so again, showing people as real people, not as types, right? These are real people with real lives. They're not sort of stereotypes or racist ideas from the time. And so Tanner obviously is trying to kind of change the minds of people in the 19th century and the sort of racism and issues going on in the South in particular at the time. Thomas Eakins' Gross Clinic is another very famous painting from America at this time, oil and canvas, in which he revives these sort of old Renaissance tenets of Leonardo da Vinci with surgery and the dissection of cadavers, etc. And so here you have this image very much based on Rembrandt's anatomy lesson, if you've seen this work before, of Nicholas Tulp from 1632, in which they're sort of breaking down the image of a cadaver. But here we have a real doctor being represented. This is Samuel Gross. Gross, not as in like this is gross, but that is his last name. Here you have Dr. Gross in the center of the image, hoping to perform this surgery in this class. Dr. Gross looks up during a break in action. In the midst of the dark, richly hued painting, light falls on his forehead, the intellectual focal point of the scene, and even more dramatically on the details of surgery. So you have this really great representation of the surgery that's occurring. You have the figures who are working on it and the students who are watching it to learn. Very much sort of the interest of surgery and what's happening in medicine at the time. And sort of the darkness and interest of a man like Dr. Samuel Gross. So I have this video describing this work and who Samuel Gross is in video number 3. And it also shows sort of this human toil of modern medicine through the horrified reaction of the seated female here, presumably a relative of the patient. She becomes sort of the bearer of emotional content. So here you have that this surgery is not only happening in this room and it's helping people to learn, but it's very much sort of inherently saving someone's life here. You also have, very interestingly enough, right here represented in the painting, here's a large image as well. Thomas Eakins represents himself in a self-portrait. Another American that we are going to talk about and sort of becomes the headline of chapter 1 of this book, which we didn't read because I sort of recapped it for the most part in the first lecture, is James McNeill Whistler. And he's a very important American artist at the time and responds a lot to Spanish Baroque masters. The butterfly was his monographic signature. I put it here. I thought it was kind of interesting. He's mostly known for his painting of his mother, arrangement in black and white. We don't really know why this was painted, even though it became this really intensely famous American work of art and became this great icon, kind of like the Mona Lisa. But the idea is that he had a different model coming in, but she didn't show up. And so his mother came, but she could not stand for long, so he seated her here and painted this image of her. Could have been something else as well. Maybe the model was tired and the mother asked to sit for her for a little bit. We're not entirely sure. So eventually Whistler is going to need some money, and he's actually going to pawn this painting off. And it's going to be received and acquired by Paris's Museo de Luxembourg. And it becomes really his claim to fame. People recognize it, and people want to purchase his work because of it, which is crazy. And it becomes this icon of motherhood, and this image sort of nuclear family and their value with this particular image. So really interesting sort of development of this image. Here's a picture of his mom. It very much looks like her. So much so that this painting is going to be featured on a stamp for the United States Postal Office in 1934 and represented in numerous pop culture images like Rocky Horror Picture Show, as a monument to mothers, as an image of mothers for a Canadian urging men to enlist. So this image is going to be used over and over and over again to represent motherhood and the strength of women and mothers. This other work that we're going to talk about is Nocturne in Black and Gold from 1874. And John Whistler really prescribed to the idea of art for art's sake, which is very sort of unusual for this time. But he's going to paint these series of nighttime images of London. This one in particular shows a firework display on a foggy night with these three sort of main colors of blue, green, and yellow. This really interesting explosive composition, which is really quite gorgeous. Here's looking closely at the explosion here as well. But it's hard to sort of get one interpretation from this piece. And what's going to happen is John Ruskin, who's a very famous critic at the time, is going to say, "I have seen and heard much of Cockney impudence before now, but never expected a coxcomb to ask 200 guineas for flinging a pot of paint in the public's face." And when he publishes this, Whistler is going to decide to sue him. Ruskin believes sort of that art possessed the power to improve society, and for him, this artwork didn't really represent that. It was sort of hard to read. He didn't know what it was about. And so Whistler is going to sue him for defamation. And he does actually win. He receives barely any money and ends up having to declare bankruptcy. But he very much defended his work and this idea of harmony and beauty. Even Ruskin's attorney asks Whistler, "Do you think you could make me see beauty in this picture?" Whistler replied, "No, I fear it would be impossible as for the musician to pour his notes into the ear of a deaf man." So he very much believed in art for art's sake, that art didn't have to represent a part of society or define something in particular. And so he defended his art with this lawsuit, which he did indeed win. John Singer Sargent is also a very famous American. You've probably seen his work before. He's a very famous portrait painter of this time, and he gains a lot of international fame for the painting of portraits. So in this portrait, for example, he paints this woman here, Madame Gautreau, who he asked to paint himself. He begged her. It was not a commission. It was not something that was commissioned from the family. And he emphasized this sort of gorgeous, daring, sexual image, which is now called Madame X, in this painting. So you have this very sort of sexual image of her in this gorgeous black dress, standing with this table here. And originally in the painting, he had her strap falling off her shoulder, and it received a ton of ridicule at the Salon of 1884, and so he did put the strap back up because he wanted to still get commissions at the time. And he really sort of felt bad about the work. It didn't really do well, but it is considered quite famous today. And it's really sort of gorgeous representation of this female woman of this woman. Another famous work that he did, this one would have been commissioned, The Daughters of Edward Darley Boyd from 1882. And this work was very famous. It was a life-size portrait of this Bostonian's four daughters posed in the foyer of the family's Parisian apartment. And it's a really interesting depiction of these girls because they do not interact. They're each sort of individually posed separately. There's this light and shadow interplay, which creates some clarity but some obscurity in that you can't even see the one female girl's face. She's hidden. She's not even turned to us, whereas her other sister has this glowing face, while as you have this sort of innocent girl playing in the center with her doll, and another girl who stands off to the left as well. They don't seem to connect with one another. Even though it's a portrait, you can't see the one girl's portrait face. So it's really sort of empty space and isolation. It was very much supposed to reflect Las Meninas by Diego Velázquez, in that it was supposed to show this sort of interplay of figures and how they would have connected with one another, but maybe showing them that they didn't connect very much to each other at all in this sort of very famous painting. And it was much loved, even though it had this sort of unusual composition. What's great is that Edward Darley Boyd ended up donating these two vases that were painted in this painting to the same museum that the painting's in. So you're able to sort of see the arrangement and the reason and the way that he would have depicted it and seen it in reality. So it gives you some sort of context to the image. I also really like this painting of the Perrion children, which is the first double portrait he did of the children of the playwright Edward Paliron. Sorry, my French is terrible. The children named Edward and Marie Louise, and it's this very sort of gorgeous image of the little boy dressed in black and the girl dressed in white, and she's really sort of the center figure of this image. Later on, Marie Louise says that she hated this. She hated sitting for this portrait. It took somewhere around 83 sittings and battles over her costume and arrangement of her hair. And so it shows this real intensity of this little girl who's clearly dissatisfied with having to be painted 83 times by John Singer Sargent, but he captured this really gorgeous image of her. The last American we're going to talk about before we get into the pre-Raphaelites is Augustus St. Gaudens by 1884 to 97 in the production of the Shaw Memorial. Now, he's a great American sculptor, and in this work, he commemorates heroes from the American Civil War in this masterpiece. And it was an image of the Battle of Fort Wagner, which was a formidable Confederate defense at the Charleston Harbor, and the Union was trying to reduce the defenses in Charleston with little success. On the 18th, the 54th Massachusetts Infantry stormed and captured the outer rifle pits surrounding the fort. Although they didn't get very far, the Colonel Robert Gould Shaw was killed with many of his men, and they eventually captured it much later. Luckily. However, it showed that the sort of crucial combat role that African American soldiers would fight bravely if given the chance. So you can see them in this image fighting alongside the North against the Confederacy to abolish slavery. All of the different black soldiers here at the bottom. So the memorial was spearheaded by Joshua Benton Smith, who was a black businessman at the time, and he called for a memorial to this event, that it being very sort of important part of the North winning against the South in the Civil War. And so this work was unveiled in 1897, and there are some great little symbols that he put in this work. The main motto here is "He forsook all to preserve the public weal," with 34 stars on the top of this on top for the States of the Union in 1864. But really, sort of the great work of St. Gaudens in his sculpture is to really strive for realism, and so he wanted to show a number of faces and ages for the infantry, for Shaw's soldiers. And so what he goes and does is to study numerous black models at the time, get these black men together to study their different facial features, around 40 different faces that he studied as models for these different figures. And so it becomes this great example of an artist going out and trying to realistically portray black men and black soldiers really as individual people versus kind of stereotypes of their faces. So he really wants to invest time into depicting these individuals and their sort of personalities and who they were as individuals at the Battle of Fort Wagner, which is a great monument versus some of the other monuments we've seen of the Civil War. The basic movement we're going to see in England now is the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. These were English painters, poets, and art critics who formed a 7-member brotherhood in which they sought to return to the abundant detail, intense color of Quattrocento Italian art. So very much based in the Renaissance, in Renaissance depictions. So they want to go back to naturalism in Florence and Flanders, before Raphael, so hence Pre-Raphaelites. And they search for some truth in Christian and religious subject, as well as history and literature, and they move towards the imitation of nature and history paintings. The first work we're going to look at is by John Everett Millais, Ophelia, and we have this image, one of the most famous Pre-Raphaelite images, of a scene depicted here from Shakespeare's Hamlet, where Ophelia, who is Hamlet's lover, driven out of her mind when her father is murdered by Hamlet, falls into a stream and drowns, very much sort of killing herself. And it becomes this very sort of romantic image for Victorian painters, such as Millais. So Millais is going to go to great lengths to depict this in detail. He's going to go and paint very particular places, such as Hogsmill River at Ewell, which is represented here, as well as in his studio. And he's going to have each flower in the painting represent something particular. So I have some examples here of what those flowers would have represented. So roses near Ophelia's cheek and dress and the field. Rose on the bank may allude to her brother Laertes, called her Rose of May. Violets, which Ophelia wears in a chain around her neck, stand for faithfulness, chastity, or death of the young. Pansies refer to love in vain. Poppy signifies death. Willow, nettle, and daisy refer to forsaken love, pain, and innocence. So he really worked to paint this painting in intense detail, and intense nature and landscape, in depicting a real place in a real river. He also painted this dress from a dress that he bought for the model to wear, who we'll talk about in a second, but really spent a lot of intense time with this painting and depicting it. Here are some drawings that he did in studies. His favorite model was Elizabeth Siddell, which was a famous model. We'll see her again in just a minute. And she posed for 4 months in a bath full of water for this work. And there were sort of lamps underneath to keep her warm. And she ended up getting this severe cold when the lights went out. And so her father said he would sue Malay if he didn't pay for the doctor's bills, which he did. So, but you can see the really intense way that he went about depicting nature in this image of nature in art in pre-Raphaelite manner. This next work is by Dante Gabriele Rossetti, Beatrice from 1863, in which he painted his wife. He married Elizabeth Siddell, who was painted in the previous image, and here she is depicted as the character Beatrice. Now, he's very much making this parallel between Italian poet Dante's despair at the death of his beloved Beatrice and the own grief of his death of his wife, Elizabeth Siddell, who died in 1862 of a drug overdose with laudanum, which is this type of drug, or opium. So after the death of his wife, he's going to sort of portray this very hazy, transcendental quality of this sort of dream or vision with all these symbolic references. So it's sort of this spiritual transfiguration, not in the moment of her death, but in this sort of sadness of sorrow and love and death. So you have these figures in the back, this being Dante, and he's looking across to love. Oh, here's Elizabeth Siddell posing for this painting. Here you have Dante looking off to love, as I previously said here, portrayed as an angel holding in her palm a flickering flame of Beatrice's life, which is about to go out. In the distance, you see Ponte Vecchio, which signifies the city of Florence, the setting for Dante's story. You have the impending death depicted by this red dove, which is the symbol of the Holy Spirit, which descends towards her, holding an opium poppy in her beak, very much having to do with the representation of Siddell's own taking of her life, and as well as the time here, which is Beatrice's death occurred at 9 on June 9th, 1290. So really this sort of very sad, tragic, romantic depiction of Rossetti losing his wife. Okay, this last work of pre-Raphaelite art is one I just want to show you briefly, by Evelyn de Morgan, Flora from 1895. And it has this very gorgeous depiction of the mythological figure of Flora, the Roman goddess of flowers, often associated with spring. And here she is in front of a nestcala or loquat tree that bears fruit in the spring. And what's great about this painting is that you can tell every bird that she represented. So here is the chaffinch and the sissikin represented in the trees, as well as these gorgeous florals and floral robes that she's depicting. And really, Evelyn de Morgan is looking back at Sandro Botticelli's Primavera, which would have been very much in the pre-Raphaelite codices to look back at art from Botticelli, who's a Renaissance painter, and she represents spring in a very similar way with the same sort of floral dress, very much celebrating Florence and Renaissance artists in her sort of modern depiction of Flora. We're going to move on to Japanese printmaking. I know this is a lot of information. Hold with me. I promise it'll get easier. This first lecture is a lot of information all crammed into one. Japanese printmaking is really going to be important for Impressionists and Post-Impressionists. It's very popular from the 17th to 19th centuries in Japan, It is part of ukiyo-e, which means pictures of the floating world in Edo, which is future Tokyo. It often depicts female beauties, kabuki actors, sumo wrestlers, scenes from history and folk tales, a lot of women in pleasure districts and sexual images. And the term came to be used in talking about the hedonistic lifestyle of theater geishas in the pleasure district. So, but it was still a very, very large representation of nature and religion as well. We're going to see that Impressionists and Post-Impressionists become highly influenced and inspired by Japanese art and printmaking because in 1868, Japan finally opens up trade with Europe after 200 years of seclusion. So we're going to see Japanese prints and how they relate to Impressionists and Post-Impressionists. So keep your eyes out because I'm going to mention them. Like Van Gogh and Gauguin, they're very much going to be inspired by Japanese printmaking. So I want to remind you of some famous Edo period printmakers. So Hokusai being one of them. You've probably seen this work before, Under the Wave off Kanagawa. But you may or may not know is it's based on a series of 36 views of Mount Fuji. Here is Mount Fuji in the background. These prints are very much based on representing Mount Fuji. It's something that people don't really notice, don't really think about because he's very much representing Mount Fuji in every image, even though it's not the center focal point. Mount Fuji held a lot of spiritual significance for the Japanese and religious significance. And so Hokusai is going to make this very intense and gorgeous print series based on this. So here are a couple more images of that print series that are just absolutely gorgeous. Go check them out. Right away, you're also going to see inspiration for from Hokusai's work in a French printmaker, Henry Riviere, who's going to create 36 views of the Eiffel Tower, which are just as interesting in many ways as 36 views of Mount Fuji, in that he doesn't always represent the Eiffel Tower as a focal point, even though it's sort of the main focus. So here are some examples. I even like this one where you can see the Eiffel Tower here in the background, but it's not the focal point of his imagery. Additionally, for all of you who said that you hated Frank Lloyd Wright during class the first week, I put this in here. My sort of personal hatred for Frank Lloyd Wright, I guess I wouldn't say hatred. My general dislike typically comes from his use of Japanese prints. And so in talking about sort of Impressionism and their interest in Japanese printmaking, Frank Lloyd Wright traveled to Japan, I think, quite often and was spending a lot of time working in exhibitions in Japanese printmaking, from what I remember. And so the interesting thing about Frank Lloyd Wright is, yes, he's using Japanese prints in his decorating, which is very interesting, and he's very inspired by them in his work. Most of the time, it seems like a lot of these people, including the post-impressionists, are really liking Japanese printmaking, not in fact for sort of their meaning or why the Japanese make these prints, but purely for aesthetic reasons. And so what you have Frank Lloyd Wright doing is hanging all of these prints and using print inspiration in his architecture and hanging prints, but purely sort of on this aesthetic reasoning, right? That they are simple, that they're modern, that their colors fit his aesthetics, whatever the case may be. So even to the fact of when he did this rendering of the Winslow's house, he seemed to even mimic the falling of the foliage here in the drawing for the Winslow house as well. So even in his sort of drawings, he's mimicking Hiroshige's use of vegetation. But again, all of this seems sort of for base level aesthetic reasons versus for actual love and care and interest in Japanese prints as a whole, which I find kind of negative, I would say. Especially that Japanese culture and printmaking has so much to say that you reduce it down to simple aesthetics is kind of silly. Okay, we are finally in the last artistic movement of this lecture series, Impressionism. So, followers of realism really start moving towards images of leisure, of the upper middle class, and the city. Artists are still going to be moving against state-funded salons. We'll see that here. They start exhibiting on their own, and the salon system is going to start to fall apart. So, with the realists, are going to start to break down the boundaries, and then Impressionism are really going to tear them down entirely. So we're going to talk about some Impressionist painters. The first Impressionist exhibition is going to happen in 1874, a very famous exhibition at this time, and we're going to talk about it. They're going to produce all of their rejected work here at this exhibition. So there are sort of two theories on how Impressionism gets its name. One is that critics moved against the work, such as Louise Leroy, who wrote that most of the work was impressionist, to critique the haphazard technique and unfinished look of the paintings. Monet and colleagues liked the label and used it, which spoke to their concern for capturing an instantaneous impression of a scene in nature. Instantaneous. So we're going to see that as one of the ideas of how Impressionism was created. Also in the name of Claude Monet's work, which we're going to talk about in about 2 slides or so. And it may be the also reason that this period was named Impressionism. Characteristics of Impressionism, this is very important, write this down. Characteristics that we have: abbreviation, speed, spontaneity, acknowledging the paint and the canvas with brushstrokes. We're going to see very thick brushstrokes. Paint, you're going to see the paint very clearly and very thick on the canvas. Artist's direct connection to work, they were portraying an impression of that space or outside image. Focus on light and color play. They're going to often do no actual black, everything made of color. And many artists are going to paint in plein air, which means in open air or outside. So they were in an effort to sort of capture the fleeting effects of light and atmosphere. Artists are going to go outside and paint nature in nature. So the first work we're looking at is Impression Sunrise from 1872. Claude Monet is really considered the founder of French Impressionism and the sort of most consistent practitioner. And he spent a lot of time painting water and nature images. I'm going to show you a couple different types, this being one of the most important. He was really focused on empiricism, which is the theory that all knowledge is derived from sense experience. So we're going to see that in this work. So he's depicting Le Havre, which was in Monet's hometown. He visited there and creates a series of paintings from this space, from this port. And this sort of became the most famous, in which you have the 2 small rowboats in the foreground, with the red sun becoming the focal point, and the middle ground with the fishing boats are included. When he was asked for a title for the catalog of this work, it couldn't really be taken for a view of Le Havre because it was an impression of it. So he said, put impression, excused for his painting from accusations of being unfinished or lacking descriptive detail. So that's how Impression Sunrise got its name, and potentially the Impressionist period. So he represents this really gorgeous and interesting transitional moment in Le Havre, where you have smokestacks starting to occur in the back, and sort of the construction of modern machinery and materials, sort of contrasted with these tiny little fishing boats in the front. What's also really gorgeous is to look at the brushstrokes of Monet. Look at the literal one stroke that he did to make that boat. That is intense and gorgeous, and he would have painted this at the scene in Le Havre, in plein air, to get this image of this port. He also painted a ruined cathedral. This is a famous series that he did in which he looked at this cathedral and studied it, around 30 views in total that he created. He thought the church's undulating stone surface a laboratory for natural light effects that he could paint without much worry about perspective. So he spent a ton of time in front of this cathedral painting every moment of light that the cathedral experienced during the day. So there's innumerable paintings of this particular cathedral and the way that he represented it in light. Monet was also really well known for his haystack studies. He lived next to a neighbor, and he would spend a lot of time sort of wheeling his canvases out and painting different lights reflected on these haystacks. What was great about these haystacks was that they would sit over the course of all the seasons, because they would harvest it and then it would sit until the spring when they would take it and use it. And so he had a lot of time to spend with these paintings, depicting them in different light, in different seasons. I just thought this was a gorgeous painting. So here's one. It usually says to some extent what season you're seeing in this image. So here's one at the end of summer. Here's one in the winter. Another as well. These are quite gorgeous, right? And you can see these really thick brushstrokes, and he's spending time sort of changing out canvases. So he's capturing that moment of light in particular, that one fleeting impressionistic moment. So there are tons of these, but Monet is really well known for spending time with different sets of locations and really getting the feeling of light and image and texture and color in that space. You probably also know him from painting water lilies. This is also another really famous series that he did. He loved water lilies and water lily flowers. And it's also interesting in later in life, when he started to develop cataracts, he saw colors differently, and you sort of see the changes in what the colors are of the water lilies and the water. So this is an example of that sort of later in his life. Renoir was another famous impressionist, and he's really well known for painting the middle class and the sort of wealthy, celebrating sort of leisure activities, very much sort of centered in beauty and feminine sensuality, and something like Moulin de la Gayette. He's very much depicting snapshots of real life, full of sort of sparkling color and light in this sort of recreational moment. So you have this sort of glamorized working class, such middle class, and replace them with young artists and friends and models, attractive people. They're smiling, dancing, chatting, innocent flirtations, but overall has this very calming mood. Renoir has this great use of brush strokes. They're very intense and scattered, that still sort of create this great piece of movement as people sort of dance and frolic around. What I also really love about this painting is the way that he has light shining through the trees. So he depicts this moment in the time of day where the sun comes through the trees and sort of glistens, kind of like a disco ball. It's kind of hard to describe unless you know what I'm talking about. And you can see all of these tiny little spots of light that are around the figures here. Edgar Degas is another very famous impressionist. However, he's very famous, although he did not paint outdoors. So like most painters that painted en plein air, he's going to be focusing on artificial light and inside theaters, and painting a lot of ballerinas and dance. So he's focusing on women's bodies and looking at these music halls to look at the movement of ballerinas in these spaces. So you have this very interesting view from the side. You could be a viewer, you could be a dancer. You have this sort of conductor leading around these ballerinas who're sort of practicing and joking around and yawning. So you have this very interesting look backstage of the physicality of the dancers and their different postures. Very interesting sort of depiction of their movement in everyday life. I really like the way that he depicts the setting or the scene as well, with sort of this foresty look that he's going for. That was definitely sort of part of the stage or the act that the ballerinas are going to be a part of. He's also well known for this sculpture that he produced of a dancer. We're not going to talk much about it, but very much also Degas and his work with Impressionism and movement. This is another very interesting painting by him, The Glass of Absinthe, which is very sort of different from his very charming look at ballerinas, which is a woman and a man sitting side by side drinking a glass of absinthe that is very sort of lethargic and lonely. Although they're sitting side by side, they're not connected. The figure of the man looks off to the right. He's sort of scraggly and rough looking, maybe looking off to a different figure, while the woman is dressed more formally but stares sort of vacantly downwards. This painting was considered sort of ugly and disgusting and shocking. Is it a denunciation of the dangers of absinthe, which would be prohibited for some time, or is it So, as I was previously stating, does it have to do with the sort of illegalization of alcohol, or absinthe more specifically, to come soon, or this sort of modernization that causes alienation between people, which you can very much feel today, probably in some effect of feeling like people are together but not together when they're on their phones. It feels very relatable. The final work that I want to show you by Degas is The Tub from 1886, and he did a lot of series of women washing and bathing in these very intimate everyday gestures, which are very different from his paintings of ballerinas, because they're very sort of bird's eye view, looking over the top of females, very much made for the consumption of male audience members. While Degas was very much reflecting in some capacity on Japanese printmaking, so here's this one, a woman emerging from the bath and the black dog, very much reflecting on this image here. What I sort of find intensely vulgar about Degas' work is that these works seem very sexual. They're clearly for males, they're not for females. The women, you don't see often their faces. They don't really have any personalities. They're just sort of these very sexual, intimate moments of women. They look like they don't know that he's there. They seem very sexual and voyeuristic. Though Degas clearly had women pose for these, he painted them in a very sort of voyeuristic, male gaze sort of way. So when you start to think then, oh, he paints ballerinas and these young girls, it starts to feel sort of very uncomfortable. So sometimes that's sort of my feeling about Degas in general. So just so you're aware, you can have your own opinion and think about what you think of him as an artist. Back to Manet, he makes an appearance in Realism, thank God, right? Bar at the Folies Bergère, he brings his controversy once again, 1881 to 82, and he starts to loosen up his brushwork. And here he paints the barmaid, a real woman named Suzanne, at the Folies Bergère, which was a large nightclub that arranged different circus and musicals. You can see in the background right here that you have this stage of people watching an act, and you have this little trapeze artist, which is represented by their tiny little feet up in the corner. This is a very famous work of art because, again, here we have a bar. There's a marbled countertop with arrangement of alcohol, oranges, and flowers. And what we have, again, represented is a woman who is a prostitute, who would be possibly selling drinks and being a barmaid, but also trying to make money potentially as a prostitute. The reason that we think this is because while oranges, which are represented here, often depict death and decay, they also symbolize prostitution often for Manet in his work. So we see that and we automatically think prostitution in this specific case. So here's a barmaid, potentially a prostitute. You have some interesting representation of a English beer, some pleasures of the flesh. They are sort of anti-German, maybe some anti-German sentiment at the time. It would have been more likely to have German beer, but in this case we have English beer. And also the signature of Manet painted carefully on this bottle here. Now, the story of this painting is very interesting because while we look at this woman, we start to realize that behind her is a mirror. So you can see that The reflection of this bottle and these bottles, as well as the countertop behind her, as well as her profile here, or the back of her body, that is, so that this is a mirror and it's reflecting what is in front of her. And so when you start to realize that, you see this figure, which may in fact be the viewer. And so there sort of stands two interpretations of this work. You have one where you are represented, you the viewer, are represented as this man coming to purchase her drinks and possibly her services as a prostitute. So you have her sort of staring at you, again, she's sort of self-absorbed. It doesn't really look like she's paying attention. She's very sort of slightly depressed. So although she's engaging with this customer, she seems sort of very uninterested in what she's doing. And so again, here we have Monet causing controversy by creating this potentially powerful figure in a woman who doesn't really care to be servicing men in sort of any capacity. The other interpretation that stands as well is that this figure here is off to the left. So here we have that this man could be staring off to the left and not engaging with the female, and that we the viewer are the one standing in front of her. And so it sort of takes this like left view. It kind of depends on who you ask and who you ask your interpretation of. But either way, it sort of represents you as the male viewer, as the male gaze upon this woman figure and sort of her disinterest in you. So this very different representation of females and individuals, that's very different sort of from Renoir's sort of happiness and silliness of leisure activities. This next work is by Gustave Caillebotte, Paris Street Rainy Day from 1977. It represents this really gorgeous image of the modernization of Paris after sort of the rain has occurred and people walk through the streets with their umbrellas. This sort of still depictions of everyday life in Paris. What's really important about Caillebotte's depiction of Paris at this time is that it is after sort of this Haussmann renovation or revitalization of Paris. So Emperor Napoleon, aka Napoleon's nephew at the time, directs Haussmann, depicted here, to demolish medieval neighborhoods, to widen avenues, new parks and squares, to make Paris better, bigger, and more interesting. And so this occurs between 53 and 70, and he's really going to fix how we see Paris today is the way that Haussmann created it to look. So for example, you would see some of these sort of very skinny streets that were sort of not very useful to people in Paris every day. And he instead really changed Paris to have these really great open scenes and plazas and parks, as you would see in these photographs and paintings. And you're going to see this in Paris Street Rainy Day. Even Claude Monet is painting Paris and being very inspired by Haussmann's revitalization of Paris at the time. So you can see that right here in this moving way that Haussmann is able to structure these squares in Paris. So Caillebotte is very much focusing in on these figures and this great image of modernity with the way these women and people are fashioned. Again, here we have upper middle class, the sort of gorgeous veil that this woman wears. And I love how Caillebotte represents water between the stones of the street of Paris as well, which is very gorgeous. This work is also really became famous recently. It's located at the Art Institute of Chicago, and they just recently restored it and took off the veneer that was very sort of yellowing. And what it ended up revealing to people at the Chicago Art Institute, which you can see sort of from my movement here back and forth, is that before they believed that it was the start of a rain and a rainy day, now they think it's sort of the end of the rain, and the rain is sort of leaving and going away, and the sky is clearing. So it sort of changed people's perspective on what this painting actually represents. these last two painters we're going to discuss from Impressionism, and we're finally done with this presentation, or these last two artists here. And we have Bertha Morisset and Marie Cassatt. So Morisset was a female artist, part of the Impressionists, and married to Manet's brother. And she was a female artist, but female artists weren't represented or respected necessarily very well in Impressionism. She said, "I don't think there was ever a man who treated a woman as an equal, and that's all I would have asked for I know I am worthy as much as they." She painted daily life and painted these really interesting images of women and women figures. And her and Mary Cassatt are going to paint these intimate and private scenes because they're considered more appropriate for women. So what we'll see is that Morisset is going to paint women and women figures. So here we have a middle-class woman, and Mary Cassatt is going to do the same with painting mothers and children. So this was painted during a summer visit to Normandy, and she paints this in really simplified brush strokes. We have the gorgeous way that she represents the veil around this woman's face, uses very little detail in this image just to represent this sort of swathing of her face underneath the veil. And it's this very bourgeoisie scene, and you can tell how wealthy these women are, or this woman is in particular, because she's not at the beach, she's just looking at the beach. She's on vacation, but she has respectability, so she can't go out and get dirty on the beach. So here and her daughter sort of playfully standing on this porch at the villa at the seaside. Again, Mary Cassatt is also very well known for these intimate scenes of daily life. So she was very popular for depicting women with their children. So here is an image of that, in particular, of a woman bathing her child. Although she sort of represents the new woman because she never married and she wanted to represent women powerfully and supported women, she still sort of depicted these moments of everyday life. So very, very powerful in this very sort of subtle way. This everyday bathing of a child, this moment that is not special but becomes special in her representation in the painting. Very sort of gentle touch of a mother and protection of the child, this little chubby little girl. Here's a later work where she represents a very similar scene. Here's a baby, a mother holding her baby, very much influenced by Japanese printmaking. So Utamaro, who is very well known for depicting women, and here is a woman with her child coming to pick up her child at night and soothe him. Mary Cassatt is doing the same thing with maternal caress here. So again, this very sort of quiet image that's very sort of gorgeous and interesting, and the way that she depicts it with flatness, very much inspired by Japanese printmaking. And she's going to go on to have quite a bit of success in the Impressionist movement. These are some more images by Mary Cassatt that I really like in this Japanese printmaking form. So next week we are heading into post-impressionism. I hope this is pretty long. I'm sorry about that. The first week is kind of long and a lot of information. But I hope to kind of condense it next week. Post-impressionism is a lot of fun too. I hope you guys weren't too bored. And so I'll try to have different ways of us learning this material other than listening to me talk, because I'm sure you guys are sick of it. So I will talk to you guys next week. We'll talk about post-impressionism. I will see you then.